In the First Descendant, there are a ton of settings that you should literally never turn on, and yet you probably still use them. Some of these settings will actually make you worse at the game, so I thought I'd make this video to let you know which settings you need to turn off. As with most games these days, these settings are turned on by default, and even though sometimes it's good to have some of these settings turned on, here's the 8 settings in the First Descendant that you need to turn off now. Lots of players these days prefer to play games at higher frame rates, especially if you've got a PC rig that can handle the maximum settings, which can turn any game into a real life simulator. The First Descendant is no different, and with it being developed in the brand new Unreal 5 game engine, it really is as next gen as they come. From the stunning cutscenes to the awesome character models and visual effects, the First Descendant really leans into what the newest Unreal engine can offer, and I know the devs have spent a ton of time optimizing the game for it. And this is why I think you should 100% change this setting. By default, the First Descendant is set to performance mode, which does provide you with that 60 FPS frame rate as standard on consoles, but as it's aimed at performance, the graphical quality of the game does take a noticeable step back. Special effects, character models, and the game itself just looks more chunky in performance mode, and although it can feel really good to play, you absolutely should be changing it to fidelity mode. This mode does drop your frames to 30 frames per second, but the graphical upgrade you receive from this is a huge positive in my opinion. Combined with the rest of the setting changes in this video, you're not really going to notice the drop in frame rate beyond the initial adjustment period, but the eye candy you get from making this simple change will more than make up for it. You can only change this setting from the title screen, so you may have to back out from your game session, but you'll instantly feel that next gen Unreal 5 engine polish immediately. Nexon have even provided this handy graphic mode guide tailored to your console of choice, with HDR options available for Series X and PlayStation 5. Make the change and let me know what you think. Motion blur is basically a setting that you only need to keep on if you want to see less stuff in the game. It adds an awful smear effect to your screen whenever there's any amount of movement, and in the First Descendant there's a lot of movement. Plus, with the setting changes in this video, there's going to be a lot more movement more often, and so I think you're definitely going to want to turn this motion blur setting off. With the high enemy density in the majority of the game, having motion blur on is going to make them way harder to see, and therefore it'll make aiming your weapons or abilities more difficult, as you literally won't be able to see them until you've stopped moving. It also makes enemies appear bigger because of the blur, so you can easily miss your shots because of it. It makes you react slower and less accurately. It can be a benefit at super low frame rates, but you have to trust me on this one and just turn it off. It is definitely not a setting that you want to be using. This next setting is a super minor one to be honest, and ultimately it probably comes down to personal preference. The First Descendant is very text heavy in the menus, and with lots of stuff to take in when it comes to adjusting your character's builds, whether it's mods, enhancements, weapons or abilities. The last thing you want is not to be able to see important text from tutorials offered by the various in-game vendors, or even to capture key plot points during the story's cutscenes. Fortunately, you can change the text size to any you wish, and this even affects the in-game text chat between you and your teammates. It's set to default by standard, but you may want to turn this up depending on what display you're playing the game on. I personally use a monitor and sit a few feet away from the screen, so I find normal is a good setting for me, but definitely fiddle with this one for your own personal preference. Seeing more is always better. Being able to see where your enemies are coming from and react before they become a problem may be the difference between completing a mission or wiping and having to start all over again. Fortunately, this next setting can help you with that. The First Descendant has a field of view slider which is set by default at a very generous 90. To be honest, this setting is actually fine, but bigger is always better, and don't you let anybody else tell you otherwise. You can max this slider out if you want, but it can give you an unfortunate side effect of feeling like you're playing a game in a fishbowl. I found that knocking it up to about 100 was a nice balance between able to see more of the action, but not too much that I started to feel like Finding Nemo. Again, fiddle with this one as much as you want, but if you've turned fidelity mode on like I mentioned earlier, then you will benefit from seeing more of the breathtaking scenery by changing this setting. There are a lot of menus in the First Descendant, and I mean a lot of menus, but this next setting is going to make navigating them a lot easier and potentially quicker. Cursor speed will affect, yes, you've guessed it, your cursor speed. I have this set as standard so my cursor isn't whizzing uncontrollably all over the screen whilst I'm trying to swap weapons, mods, or even changing these settings we've already run through in this video. Try upping it if you want, which will give you a bit more flexibility to change stuff on the fly in mid-combat. Speaking of combat, there's an absolute metric ton of it in the First Descendant as you might expect, so unless you want to end your epic play session feeling like you spent a full day on the power tools, you may want to turn vibration off. You can leave it on if you really want, but I recommend turning it off if you care about hitting your targets or placing your abilities exactly where you want them. This only applies to controller vibration, and even though I understand you might love the immersion provided by this neat bit of technology, but by turning it off it may just extend the lifespan of your controller, and it's also going to make your hands less tired in the long run. It also drains your battery quicker with it turned on, and you definitely won't miss it if you get used to relying on the in-game radar, sound effects, and by keeping an eye on your health bar and visuals provided. Now that you've got your field of view, graphics and vibration settings all sorted, these last two pieces of the puzzle are really going to take your gameplay experience in the First Descendant to the next level. You'll find that a lot of encounters pit you against vast waves of enemies which will swarm at you from all angles, and this next setting may well just be the most important out of all of them we've discussed in this video. By changing these settings, you'll be able to flick between combatants faster and even turn on your enemy's matrix style. The X and Y axis sensitivity modifiers affect how fast your character and weapon reticles can move around the screen in different directions. By default, the X and Y axis sensitivity is very low both for the normal and aim sensitivity. Playing at the default setting is going to feel really sluggish, and I feel it actively counteracts the playstyle the game genuinely wants you to feel. This is why I've turned the normal sensitivity up to around the 70 to 80 mark. This is going to make your character movements more fluid as you move around and makes combat feel a ton smoother. Combine this with the aim sensitivity by setting it at 50/25, which for me felt like a really nice sweet spot when aiming your weapons, feeling just sticky enough to constantly hit your targets. As a bonus tip here, you have full access to a suite of accessibility options, including Colourblind Settings. Selecting this option will open you up to change plenty of in-game options to what settings work best for you. Making these changes in-game will affect both menus and gameplay, changing the colour of weapon reticles and icons, which even if you don't need to change these settings, they might be worth visiting. Changing the colour of your weapon reticle or radar will definitely come in handy, as the base default settings can sometimes get lost in the background, especially during combat. Let me know if you're going to be trying this one out during the open beta, and please subscribe for more First Descendant content, which I'll be covering between now up to the release date and beyond. Did you know that you can literally walk on water with the newest character in the First Descendant? Find out more about it by watching this next video, where I break down all of Valby's abilities and how to maximise them.